Good evening. Having Professor Bernard Lewis with us at this period every year as a guest of the Mortimer and Raymond Sackler Institute of Advanced Studies and the Dayan Center is not only a long-time tradition, but arguably the highlight of our yearly activities at the Institute. I've had the repeated pleasures to introduce Professor Lewis in previous years, and I thought this year to try something new, maybe starting a new tradition by asking a colleague on our faculty to make the introduction. So instead of introducing Professor Lewis, I will introduce the introducer, Professor Emmanuel Marks, who is an anthropologist, one of the leaders of this field in Israel. His studies focus on Muslim and Arab societies. He was the first to make a systematic study of the Bedouin culture in the Middle East, in Israel. For his studies, he received the Israel Prize in Anthropology, and I thank him very much for agreeing to make the introduction today. Please.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to introduce a man who needs no introduction. For Bernard Lewis has been a major figure in Oriental studies for so long. He has 70 years of writing behind him and over 30 books, and it's very hard to follow all his writings and over all these years. Still, a few words about his career, only as a mark of respect. And here I have to be very careful, because being of British background, I have to take care to use understatement, not to put the paint on too thickly. So Bernard Lewis was born in 1916 in London. He took his PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies in 1939. And 10 years later, he became the chair of a new department of Near Eastern, Middle Eastern history, also in the School of Oriental and African Studies. Then in 1974, he left for America, where he worked most of the time at Prinston and the Institute for Advanced Study in Prinston from 1974 to 1986, and then he had a short spell at Cornell University, and now he's continuing to work even harder. Now he's written a number of, out of the large number of books he has written, I'd like to pick out what Islam is all about. Then I'd like to pick out an introduction to Goldzier's Introduction to Islamic Theology and Law, which appeared in 1981. The original book in German appeared in 1910, I think. And there was also a Hebrew translation, which appeared much earlier than the English one, in fact. And I picked out this book because I think that Goldzier was unique in his generation, and I feel that Bernard Lewis is the only Orientalist today who is really following in his footsteps. And I hope you're not insulted by this thing. It's meant as a compliment. I think that Goldzier's work is admirable, and for the same reasons is Bernard Lewis's. And let me point out some of the reasons. First of all, his vision is very broad. He encompasses the whole Islamic world over generations. His scholarship is sound and profound, and he goes always back to primary sources. And there's a clarity of exposition He writes very clearly and very succinctly. And then he is always involved in academic disputes, and I think this is admirable. We academics usually are involved in disputes, but they're not academic. They're always on a personal level, whereas academic disputes advance knowledge. And finally, there's an underlying tolerance of other viewpoints. And the other book, the last book I want to refer to is What Went Wrong? The Clash Between Islam and Modernity, which appeared in 2002, and that reveals another side of Bernard Lewis. He is a public figure, and he writes very forcefully and is involved in politics. And he gives as much as he receives. And there's a whole literature of anti-Lewisism, and you have only to read how harsh the criticism is. Now, I don't think I agree to everything that Bernard Lewis says in that book, but it's very important for scholars to be involved in politics, although they ought to know that their success is usually going to be nil, but at least they have to make an effort in order to be involved. And now it's the turn of Professor Bernard Lewis himself to say all the wonderful things we are waiting to hear.
One is accustomed to begin with Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, but now I suppose I should say Mrs. Chairman and ladies and gentlemen. It is always a pleasure and a delight to be back here after more years than I care to remember. What is it, 25, something like that? Yeah. More than that, yes. And it's always delightful, which is to be expected, but it's always surprising, and that again is a reason for gratitude. I won't waste any more time on the formalities or informalities, but get down to business. My subject this evening I defined as Orthodoxy and Heresy in Middle Eastern religions. Now, these are all terms which I think need some definition so that we shall know what we're talking about, or listening as the case may be. Let me begin with Middle Eastern religions. This normally means the well-known sequence of 3 consecutive religious revelations: Judaism, its offshoot Christianity, their offshoot Islam. 3 religions which are linked in historical succession with an enormous amount of common ground, which of course made it much easier to argue and quarrel and fight. I shall be speaking principally of these 3, but I also want to add a 4th that I think is extremely important and is often overlooked, and that is the religious tradition of Iran, of which we have again been reminded rather forcibly of late. When the Jews met the Iranians for the first time, towards the end of the Babylonian captivity, and the meeting seems to have been one welcomed by both sides. Cyrus the Mede is perhaps the only non-Jewish ruler accorded such enormous respect in the Hebrew Bible, more than any other non-Jewish and more than I suppose most Jewish rulers. He is described in the last chapters of the book of Isaiah. God quotes Cyrus as my shepherd, Ro'i. In the following chapter, an even more astonishing statement. This time God in the 3rd person is referring to Cyrus as Meshicho. How shall we translate Meshicho? Well, literally, textually, his anointed one. The Hebrew Mashiach, corresponding to the Arabic Masih, corresponding to the Greek Christos, all words meaning anointed. And the implications of these terms will, I think, be obvious. When the Jews met the Persians and the Persians met the Jews at the end of the Babylonian captivity, and Cyrus enabled the Jews to return to the Holy Land, this encounter seems to have had an enormous impact. There are striking differences between the books of the Old Testament that predate and those that follow the Babylonian captivity. And let me draw your attention rapidly in passing to what seem to me to be the most important, some of the most important aspects of the Iranian impact on Jewish religion. One is the idea of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, each led by one supreme figure, God and the devil, variously known as Satan, Mephistopheles, Ahriman, and other names. If you will look at the difference between the serpent tempter in the early chapters and the satanic figure of the later chapters and of post-biblical Judaism and Christianity, you must, I think, agree that there is a striking difference. And I don't think there is much doubt in establishing the pedigree and ancestry of Satan. He was a native of Iran and an Iranian citizen by birth. Together with this idea, the cosmic struggle of good and evil, there is the idea of a judgment after death, an accounting of sins and virtues, ending with consignment to either the joys of heaven or the torments of hell. Again, if you look at the earlier books of the Old Testament, references to after death are few and vague. All this, again, I think may be ascribed, not unreasonably, to the impact on Judaism of another religious tradition, and that of Iran. And perhaps most important of all is the Iranian tradition of the Saouchant, the descendant of the line of Zoroaster, who at the end of time will return to this world and establish the kingdom of heaven on earth. In other words, the Messianic tradition, which is invisible in pre-exilic Judaism, dominant in post-exilic Judaism. And I did once, in a moment of rashness, describe the rise of Christianity as a result of the impact of Iranian religion on Judaism. This is perhaps somewhat overstated, but I don't think it's entirely false. These things are already discernible, as I said, in the later books of biblical Judaism. They appear more strongly in post-biblical Judaism and Christianity, and more strongly still in Islam, where the Iranian element, and more particularly what you might call the apocalyptic messianic element, becomes very strong, and which we are confronting in a particularly dangerous form at the present day. Can I have some water? Thank you. Let me turn now to before that, briefly a few other references to the later impact of Iranian religion. And I refer in particular to one, a religious trend known as Manichaeism, founded by a certain Mani, a heretic within the Zoroastrian tradition, whose ideas had an enormous impact on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and underlie many of what are sometimes called the heresies in all three religions. Let me turn now to the two major terms that I have used, orthodoxy and heresy. But before I discuss them, there is a general point which I think it is necessary to make. I am addressing you this evening in English, a language which has been shaped and conditioned by 2 millennia of Christian practice, Christian notions, Christian ideas. And this is true not only of English, but of all the other languages of Christendom, and beyond that, to a remarkable extent, even of languages outside Christendom in their modern versions. Modern Arabic, modern Persian, modern Turkish, modern Hebrew are all profoundly affected by the Christian European tradition, which appears in the language they use and so on. And no example of that is more obvious than in one of the two terms I have chosen to discuss, the term orthodoxy. This is both words, orthodoxy and heresy, are of course Greek. Orthodoxy is a Platonic term first used by the Greek philosopher Plato and then adopted by the Christian churches. Translated literally, it means the right idea. Ortho as in orthography, correct writing. Orthodoxy has also been defined as my idea. Orthodoxy is my doxy, heterodoxy is anybody else's doxy. An informal, but I think not inaccurate, definition of common usage. Heresy is a Greek word which originally simply means choice. And human nature being what it is, it was soon specialized to mean a wrong choice. What do these terms mean? I'm sorry. It's interesting that the term orthodoxy has been very much adopted by Jews. And many seem to think that it is a specifically Jewish term, and that it describes one form of Judaism as contrasted with others, for which, however, they do not use the term heresy. That's a different thing. Now, correct belief, incorrect belief. What does correct mean, and who defines it, and how? Like so much else in the language we use, both terms have classical roots, as, for example, does also the term religion. Religion, from the Latin religio, goes back to the worship of pagan Rome. And if we look at even our most intimate Jewish vocabulary, we find some rather startling facts. Dat, the Hebrew word for religion. It's a late word. We find it in an Aramaic form, data, and it's probably a word of Persian origin, meaning law. Judaism, well, in Hebrew, that's Yahadut. What could be more Hebrew than the word Yahadut? Curious thing is that the word Yahadut occurs for the first time in Hebrew in the writings of Rashi, in medieval France, in medieval Christendom. It does not appear at all, at least it has not so far been discovered, in any of the earlier Jewish writings in Hebrew or Aramaic. We do find it in Greek, in the books, some of the books of the Apocrypha, in the book of Maccabees, for example, in the form Judaismos, which obviously sounds like Judaism, but it doesn't really mean Judaism in the sense of a theology and a religion. Judaismos means a Jewish way of life, as opposed to Hellenismos, a Greek way of life. A more accurate translation of the classical Greek Judaismos would be Yiddishkeit. I hope that makes my meaning clear. Heresy, as I said, means choice, and specialized to mean a wrong choice. One may make a distinction, I think, between heresy and a related notion, that of schism. Schism meaning a split, a division. Locke, in his famous essay on toleration, says that the difference is that heresy relates to doctrine and belief, whereas schism relates to worship and organization. Not a bad definition of the difference. It's interesting that in talking of both Jewish and Muslim religion, we hardly ever use the word schism or schismatic. We do frequently use the word heresy and heretic, though more so of Muslims than of Jews. In general, correct belief was not an important issue either for Muslims or for Jews. They were not concerned with defining correct belief. There are no equivalents in either Jewish or Muslim history of the long and bitter arguments between churches to define the Christian faith. There are no equivalents to such things as the Nicene Creed, the creed which was evolved and agreed by a council of bishops in Nicaea, now in Turkey, or other texts which were fought over, agreed, accepted, rejected, and so forth. Jews, like Muslims, were more concerned not so much with orthodoxy, but with what one might call orthopraxy. Not what you believe, but what you do. Nevertheless, the question of correct and incorrect belief was not an unimportant one, and received considerable attention. Now, as I remarked, in Christendom, and this is from the earliest times, correct belief is defined by some duly constituted ecclesiastical authority. This arose from the special circumstances of the birth and rise of Christianity. Christ was crucified. His followers were a persecuted minority for 3 centuries before the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, which began the double process of the Christianization of Rome and the Romanization of Christ. Islam didn't have to go through that painful phrase. Muhammad was not crucified, not he, but his enemies were put to death. And Islam became the state religion, the religion of the rulers, from the lifetime of the Prophet onwards. The agonizing questions of Christendom, of relations between church and state, and between ecclesiastical and secular authority, simply did not arise. The absence of these questions is perhaps most clearly demonstrated by the absence, even in the rich classical Arabic language, of a vocabulary to describe them. There's no word in classical Arabic for secular or ecclesiastical. In Hebrew, one can distinguish bein kodesh lechol, but that is usually in a somewhat different context, not of institutions, but of ending the Sabbath. The definition of heresy is, of course, a natural consequence of the definition of correct belief, which came to be called orthodoxy. Now, we all always tend to look at others in terms of ourselves, to see others through our own eyes, the only ones we have. The story is told of an English clergyman, a Church of England clergyman, who was a specialist on Jewish matters. And he wrote a book with the title, The Systematic Theology of the Synagogue. And it was reviewed by a Jewish rabbi, whose review began, "First, there is no such thing as the synagogue. And if there were, it wouldn't have a theology. And if it did, it would not be systematic." He had a good point. The mosque is the equivalent of the church as a building, as a place of worship, as the synagogue is. But in the sense in which the church is used in Christian history, there is no Muslim or Jewish equivalent. And that, I think, is important to bear in mind in defining these terms. Correct belief for Muslims is a very simple matter. There is some argument about it, but it doesn't amount to a great deal. And most agreed of the simplest, most straightforward definition. Anyone who believes that there is one God and that Muhammad is his prophet and who prays towards Mecca is a Muslim. With Jews, as we know, it was much more a question of what you do than of what you believe. And that, of course, could be quite exacting. The notion of heresy, I tried as an experiment looking up the word heretic in some English Hebrew dictionaries and found kofar, epikoros, and other words of the same sort. Now that is not the same as heretic. Apparently these lexicographers were unable to find an appropriate term. Some say min, which again is closer, but is not the same thing as heretic. In Islamic usage, since they had a much wider range, there are a number of terms which, shall we say, approximate to the idea of heresy in Christendom. And they're worth looking at in greater detail because they embody a number of interesting different notions of what religious identity, religious correctness is about. The first one is the Arabic word bid'ah. Bid'ah literally means innovation, starting something new. And as a matter of general principle, a bid'ah is assumed to be bad. Since revelation and law are divine, eternal, and unchanging, any change must therefore be incorrect, wrong, blameworthy, sinful. However, the idea was accepted eventually that there can be some necessary changes, some necessary innovations. So the term adopted was bid'ah hasana, which you might translate as an okay innovation. A rather informal translation, but I think it expresses the notion. That is to say, something which is not explicitly dealt with in the classical legal and theological texts, for which some amplification is required, and that sort of bid'ah is therefore permissible. But unless specifically described as good, a bid'ah is assumed to be bad, and the term bid'ah is itself a negative term. Probably the one most frequently used to describe those versions of Islamic doctrine or teaching or practice which deviate from the mainstream. Now, I've used two words there which I haven't used before. I think mainstream is probably the nearest one can get in English to an equivalent for orthodoxy. Mainstream is the majority view, the majority practice of Muslims wherever they may be. And deviation from it is seen as something reprehensible, something to be condemned or avoided. And the term that is used in Islam for that is ilhad, which has the literal meaning of deviation, and going aside, going away from. Another term which is sometimes used is ghulu, and those who practice ghulu are called ghulat. The underlying notion of that Arabic word is excess, overdoing it. You may have some good ideas, you may have some acceptable religious beliefs, but don't overdo them. If you carry them to excess, that is not approved, that is reprehensible. And that is called ghulu. A word which will be familiar to everyone is the word Shia. Shia in itself is innocuous. Shia simply means a party or faction. If it's of a good guy, it's a good Shia. If it's of a bad guy, it's a bad Shia. But forming a party apart from the rest is in itself suspicious. And therefore, like the bid'ah hasana, which I mentioned before, the good innovation, we also have the notion of tashayyu hasan, a good partisanship, a level of difference which is permissible. And this raises, I think, a very important principle of Sunni Islam. The notion expressed in a classical formulation, ikhtilafu ummati rahmah, meaning difference of opinion within my community, meaning God's community, is mercy. A rather striking notion to find in a religious text, that diversity is a good thing. Difference of opinion, ikhtilaf, is a good thing, provided, of course, it doesn't go too far. And this notion of ikhtilaf is a very important one, which one finds right through Islamic history, less in the modern period than in earlier times. It was used, for example, to justify the coexistence side by side in Islam of 4 different schools of jurisprudence. The Muslims, like the Jews, have a scripture, and they also have an oral law, orally transmitted and at some stage committed to writing, which amplifies and expands the written holy law. And this is what is known as the Sunnah. And it in many ways follows the same pattern as the Talmud, as the development of Talmudic Judaism. Indeed, it is striking that it happens more or less in the same place, in Iraq, not long afterwards. And the late Professor Goitein suggested interesting parallels and connections between the development of Talmudic Judaism and the development of Sharia, a holy law, among the Muslims. Now, what is interesting and distinctive in Islam is that there are differences of opinion among the doctors of the holy law. There are different schools of holy law, and 4 have survived into the modern age. And they disagree sometimes on quite serious matters, but all 4 are accepted as, quote, orthodox, unquote, as being, so to speak, within the permitted limits of disagreement. That, I think, is quite a remarkable notion. If, however, they deviate beyond the permitted limits, then what are they? Well, they may be accused, as I said variously, of bid'ah, of kufr, of hulu, of ilhad, and so on. A term which is sometimes used to describe some of the more outrageous deviations is the term zindiq. The person is zindiq, the doctrine is zandaka. This is a word of Iranian origin and seems originally to have meant Manichees. It is those who introduced alien, normally Iranian notions into Islam. And of course we find traces of that in Judaism too. The Shia went beyond the permitted limits. From the Sunni Muslim point of view, that is to say, the mainstream Muslim point of view, the Shia, who also have their own school of theology and jurisprudence, but they go beyond the permitted limits of disagreement. And among the Shia, there are further disagreements. The Shia proved very vociferous. They split up into a number of different groups, including such well-known groups as the Ismailis, who split again into the Druze, and then others, various branches of the Ismailis, the Alawis, who are now found in Turkey and in Syria, and the like, some of whose doctrines do indeed go very far from what you might call, quote, orthodox, unquote, Islam. Now, as I remarked before, in Islam, there is no pope, there is no church, there are no bishops. At least, I should use the past tense of that. The Iranian Revolution has, I think, accomplished for the first time what one might call the institutional Christianization of Islam. In Iran now, for the first time in Islamic history, they have the functional, not theological, the functional equivalence of a pope, a college of cardinals, a bench of bishops, and above all, an inquisition. But for most of Islamic history, there was no church, no popes, no councils, no creed, and so on. There were attempts made to achieve these, and there's a rather striking passage in the writings of the great Muslim theologian al-Ghazali, who speaks with horror of those, he said, of those who would make paradise the waqf of a clique of theologians. I think puts it very nicely. What determined what was acceptable or not was what in Islamic usage is called ijma'. I suppose the nearest one can get to translating ijma' is consensus. Consensus may vary from place to place and from time to time, but generally the system seems to have worked fairly well. And consensus ijma' was broad enough to include a fair amount of variety, still remaining within the confines of Sunni or Orthodox Islam. Now, we're hearing a great deal at the present time about the Sunni-Shia conflict, and people have tried to explain this in various ways. It's always helpful to explain things, to explain the unknown in terms of the known. And an effort has been made in many quarters to explain that the Sunnis and the Shia are the Protestants and Catholics in Islam. To which I think one may ask, which are the Protestants and which are the Catholics? And that question is unanswerable because it's meaningless. The parallel is totally false. The split between Protestants and Catholics arose over a question of ecclesiastical authority. The authority of the Pope, the authority of one church over another. There was no such thing in Islamic history. The difference between Sunni and Shia in origin was a purely political one. It was a quarrel over the succession. The Prophet died, leaving the headship of the community of Muslims that he had created vacant. As Prophet, he had and needed no successor. He was, in Muslim terms, the last of the prophets. But as head of the community, a successor was needed. And so one was appointed with the title Khalifa, which, by a fortunate ambiguity, combines the meanings of deputy and successor. The quarrel first arose over who should be the Khalifa and the Prophet. And there were some who felt that this belonged to his descendants. He had no sons, but his daughter was married and he had grandsons. The claimant was his son-in-law and cousin Ali. He was not successful the first time. He became caliph at a later stage. He was murdered. His descendants for a while tried to take over the caliphate. They failed. And this caused a series of bloody wars and rebellions which have shaped Muslim history and still more Muslim perceptions ever since. The term Shiite has come to be used in a broad sense of the followers of Ali and of his descendants, the claimants to the caliphate known as the Imams. The early history of Islam, that's to say the half century following the death of the Prophet, was very troubled. Of the first four caliphs, who succeeded him, known in Sunni Islam as the righteous caliphs. 3 were murdered. And the period ended in the first of a series of civil wars between Muslims. But these were not about theology. They were not about doctrine. They were about power. They were about who should rule. And the question was, who is entitled to rule? And if one rules who is not entitled, he is a usurper. The discussion, the very intense and ongoing debate about the legitimacy of a ruler. And it turns on 2 issues. One, is he entitled to the position that he holds? Is he entitled to rule? If not, he is a usurper. And does he rule well or badly? And if not, he is a tyrant. Usurper and tyrant are not the same thing. One can be one without the other. But normally they are seen, at least, to coincide. The Shia developed into the main opposition movement within Islam. And because the original political differences developed also into differences on other matters, not so much on matters of doctrine as on questions of law and usage, this came to acquire something of the quality of a religious sect. One, I think, can use the word sect, another Christian term, before one gets to using the term heresy. And indeed, I spoke a moment ago of the difficulty of finding an equivalent for the term heresy. Well, in Hebrew, we sort of mean is the nearest you can get, which is not very near. In Arabic, there were a number of different notions which express a number of different terms which express parallel notions. In modern Arabic, finally, they have found a word for heresy, hartaka. It is obviously a loan word, a borrowing from the West. It's interesting that in a culture as intensely religious as that of Islam, it was found necessary to borrow a word from Christendom to express this fundamentally alien notion. We find, by the way, the same problem in expressing the notion of lay or secular. In Persian and Turkish, they use the word laïc, obviously from French. In Arabic, they have a genuine Arabic term, which is variously vocalized as alamani or elmani. They had one because there's a fairly important Christian population using the Arabic language from the earliest times to the present day. And the Arabic-speaking Christians, therefore, developed a Christian vocabulary in Arabic, which came in very useful when they were trying to modernize the Arabic language on a broader scale at the present time. After the spread of Islam by conquest eastwards to Iraq and Iran and Central Asia and India, westwards to Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, Europe, after the spread of Islam, a new element enters the situation. That is the new converts to Islam. These were people who were converted to Islam, who became Muslims, but did not become Arabs. And they brought with them all kinds of practices and notions and attitudes from their previous religions, many of which were alien to Islam, some of them indeed contradictory to Islam, but which nevertheless affected Muslim belief and practice in a number of ways. It is to these that we must look for the origins or the sources of some of the ideas excuse me, that are classified as heretical in the classical theological literature. Shiism gradually developed into what I think one can not unreasonably call a sect. But at no time can one honestly compare it with the conflict of Protestants and Catholics in Europe, in Christendom, that is to say, at that time. They differed, but persecutions are rare and generally a response to armed rebellion. There is nothing in Islamic history to resemble the long and bitter struggle following the Reformation in Europe, the 30 Years' War, the persecutions, the expulsions, and the rest. The nearest we get to such a thing is on the two occasions when Shiites succeeded in establishing a real imperial power. The first was the Fatimid Caliphate, which ruled from North Africa, then Egypt, and parts of the Middle East. They arose from a branch of the Shia, the Ismailis. They confronted the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad, rejecting their authority and offering themselves as an alternative leadership of the Muslim world. But this was a rivalry between two imperial dynasties using religion rather than a conflict between rival versions of the faith. We find it again from the 16th century, I should say, the 16th century onwards, when a Shiite dynasty seized power in Iran, the Safavids. There had been some local Shiite dynasties here and there in the Islamic world before that, but apart from the Ismaili Fatimids, nothing very important. The ascent to power of the Safavids in Iran was something new. You had a Shiite dynasty, a militant Shiite dynasty, maintaining a militant Shiite state, emphasizing its Shiite doctrines, partly in order to differentiate itself from the Ottomans to the west and the various Muslim powers of Central Asia and India to the east, all of whom were Sunni. It served as a useful focus point of differentiation, concentration, and identity. The long struggle between the Ottomans and the Safavids, or between Turkey and Persia, if you prefer to put it that way, did acquire a certain religious coloring. And from time to time, Sunnis in Iran and Shia in the Ottoman lands were viewed with suspicion and even persecuted. But it began with that, it virtually ended with that. And as I say, it is not remotely comparable to what happened in Christendom. One interesting relic of that is Iraq, a country which is a particular concern at the present day. Iraq, as you know, was the seat of the great Abbasid Caliphate, the center of the Islamic world for almost half a millennium. But the Abbasids were overthrown, destroyed. The Caliphate was destroyed by the Mongols. The seats of Muslim power moved elsewhere, to Cairo, and then to Istanbul and other places in the east. And I'm sorry. That aspect of it became less important. It re-emerged with the Safavids in Iran in this way. Iraq ceased to be a seat of power. It was ruled by various neighboring powers, first by the Mongols and then by the successor states of the Mongols. And somehow, at some time, we don't know precisely when or how, the Shia came to be the majority of the population. This seems to have happened at a fairly early stage. A decisive period was the beginning of the 16th century, when the Safavids of Iran succeeded in extending their rule to Iraq, so that for something less than half a century, Iraq was ruled by a Shiite dynasty from Iran. The Ottomans succeeded in reconquering it, but it remained a battlefield between the Sunni Ottomans and the Shiite Iranians for a long time after that. What happened in Iraq was something I can best describe by borrowing a word from Irish history. What happened was an ascendancy. You had a Shiite population with a Sunni ascendancy. And this was true for obvious reasons under the Ottomans. It was maintained for less obvious reasons under the British, and then again under the monarchy and the various dictators. Recent events for the first time have given the Shia in Iraq an opportunity which they have not had for many centuries. And this gives a special anguish, I would say, to the struggle that is going on at the present time. Let me come back for a moment to some of the distinctive features of the Shia version of Islam. As I said, the Shia were in most places, at most times, a minority. They were a subject minority. They were not part of the dominant group. And although I think it would be an overstatement to say that they were persecuted, nevertheless they did not enjoy equal status and opportunity with followers of the majority faith. We don't often find them in positions of power, authority, or profit. And this gave rise also to certain quite distinctive features of Shia doctrine and theology, the most important of which is the principle known as taqiyya, which is usually translated dissimulation. It is permitted, if you are in danger of persecution, to hide your beliefs, to pretend to be something other than what you are. Such practice is, of course, part of our common humanity, but it's unusual to find it laid down as a religious doctrine. One other peculiarity of Shiite law, which I mentioned in passing, is the practice of muta, which is temporary marriage. It is permitted in Shiite law to enter into a marriage with the usual documents and agreements, but with a time limit on it, so that at the end of the period specified in the marriage document, the marriage is automatically terminated. There is no minimum time for that. The implications are, I think, fairly clear. Let us look at the division of the Islamic world at the present time. Consider it in three categories. The first is countries that are wholly or predominantly Sunni. Now this includes virtually the whole of the continent of Africa. African Islam, whether in the Arab North or the Black South, is overwhelmingly Sunni. There are some other groups, but they have nothing to do with the Shia. They are a different sect, which we won't go into at the present time. Latterly, there has been some development of Shia groups in Africa by immigration from Asia. At the time when East Africa and India were both under British rule, there was some migration of Shia Muslims from India to East Africa. And there are now small communities of Muslims of various Shia subgroups in East Africa. But generally speaking, as I said, African Islam is overwhelmingly Sunni, to such an extent that Shiism is practically unknown. It's something they read about in the newspapers. And in a region which is so entirely Sunni, where there virtually are no Shia, it's not an issue, it's not important. They don't think about it very much, they don't talk about it very much. I have actually been asked by someone, an Egyptian, am I Sunni or Shia? The person in question simply wasn't sure what this terminology meant. That was a rather westernized person, but nevertheless, I think it illustrates the general principle that it was not a matter of any importance. Then you have the much smaller area, which is wholly or predominantly Shia. And that is principally Iran, which, since the accession to power of the Safavids at the beginning of the 16th century, has been under Shia rulers, with rare intervals of exception, under Shia rulers, and has gradually come to be a Shia majority country. The third category, the one which is obviously the most troublesome at the present time, is that the areas where Sunni and Shia are mixed, sometimes dominated by the one, sometimes dominated by the other, sometimes disputed. And here I should mention that also there are, how should I put it, groups which are offshoots of the Shia rather than mainstream Shia, such as the Zaydis and the Yemen, a branch of the Shia, not the same as those who are normally known as the Shia, or the Ismailis, who are found in Syria, in the Indian subcontinent, and now in quite large numbers in Canada, by migration. Yes. Iran has had phases of both. It was once predominantly Sunni. It then became predominantly Shia and has remained so to the present day, though there are important Sunni populations still surviving in Iran. And I would not say that the matter is finally settled. Iraq, I've already discussed, a mixed population, predominantly Shia, but under a Sunni ascendancy, which now for the first time in centuries is seriously challenged. And this raises an extraordinarily interesting question, the relative importance of ethnic and of religious identity. It's striking, for example, that during the 8-year war between Saddam Hussein's Iraq and the Iranian Revolution, there were expectations on both sides which were not fulfilled. The Iranians expected the Shia of Iran to rally to their cause. The Iraqis expected the sizable Arab minority in southwestern Iran to rally to their cause. Both were disappointed. The state allegiance proved stronger than either religious or ethnic identity. But that is no guarantee that it will remain so. Apart from Iraq, there are Shia populations in a number of other places, both east and west Iran and Iraq, in Syria and Lebanon. In Syria, they are mostly of extreme Shia sects, Alawis, Ismailis, and such like. In Lebanon, they are what you might call Orthodox Shia. I think I just created a new term. In Central Asia, in the former Soviet territories, there are again very mixed populations, Sunni and Shia of various persuasions. And the same is true of the Indian subcontinent, India and Pakistan, where Sunni-Shia rivalries have sometimes become very bitter and very violent. At the present time, we are encountering Shiism in a new form, without precedent for centuries past. And I'm referring to the two phases, phase 1 and phase 2, of the Iranian Revolution. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was a genuine revolution. in the sense in which we speak of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. The word revolution, as you know, has been much used with virtually every change of government in the Middle East. In fact, revolutionary is the only generally accepted title to legitimacy. But it's meaningless. In the case of Iran, it was not meaningless. This was a genuine revolution, a real shift of power, a real ideology, and most important for our present purpose, a tremendous impact in the whole world with which they shared a common universe of discourse. The Iranian Revolution had impacted westwards across Islam as far as Morocco, eastwards as far as Indonesia, Black Africa and many other places. This has somewhat diminished since then, as the Iranian Revolution went into its terror and its Stalinist phase and the like. But now the Iranian Revolution has entered its second phase, which I am tempted to call the apocalyptic phase. And this I think we must take very seriously. There are a group of people in Iran who are known as the Hojatiyah. And they believe that the apocalyptic age is now. Islam, like Christianity, like Judaism, has its messianic scenario. The struggle at the end of time against an enemy who may be called Gog and Magog, or Antichrist, or in Islam, Dajjal and the like, and the final battle ending, of course, in the final victory of God's anointed. In the Islamic version of this, there's a Sunni version and a Shia version, which differ on quite significant points. In the Shia version, the messianic figure is the 12th Imam. After the death of Ali, there was a series of his descendants for 12 generations who were not rulers but were claimants. The 12th one disappeared in mysterious circumstances and became a messianic figure whose return is awaited by all pious Shia. He is the Mahdi, who will establish the kingdom of heaven on earth, meaning, of course, the supremacy of the faithful and the destruction of the rest, who find their proper place in hell. It is quite clear that this group of people really believe that this time is now. I have heard it said that Ahmadinejad is playing games, that it's a trick, that it's a propaganda line. My information, such as it is, and I think it's good, does not support this. It would seem that he and his immediate circle really believe that the apocalyptic age is now, that the Mahdi has either come or is about to come, and that the final struggle is approaching. And Muslims, like Jews, believe that when the Messiah is coming, you can take steps to hasten the process. I would draw your attention to the fact that among the disciples of Ahmadinejad is a certain Aghazadeh, one of his most faithful and loyal followers, who also happens to be the head of the Iranian Nuclear Commission. I think we should not delude ourselves as to the nature of the threat that we now confront from Iran. During the years of the Cold War, both sides, the United States and the Soviet Union, had nuclear weapons. But neither side used them because both sides knew that the others would retaliate in kind. It was known as MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. But for people with this apocalyptic mindset, mutual assured destruction is not a deterrent, it's an inducement. I will leave you with that thought.
Thank you. very much, Professor Lewis, for a most illuminating talk. And I'm sure Professor Lewis would be ready to answer questions if there are any. Please, you can use the speaker on the side.
Can I start?
I don't think you can be heard. You have to use the speaker.
Keep everybody here. Professor Lewis, thank you for your lecture. It's very interesting, by the way. Whatever, it's on. Okay. Thank you very much for your lecture, which was very, very interesting. But you did not mention neither Jordan nor Israel when it comes to the Palestinians and the Arab population. Manyan, I would like to know what the division is of Sunni and Shiite.
The Jordanians and the Palestinians are entirely Sunni. As far as I know, there never has been a Shia minority in this whole area, except, of course, during the period of the Fatimid Caliphate, but that was a long time ago.
Please.
May I just add a word on that? It is perhaps for that reason that the Jordanians in particular, and also others, are very much concerned at the rise of Shiite power in the region. They see this as a major threat. We already see a sort of Shiite axis stretching from Iran westwards across Iraq through Syria to Lebanon, in other words, from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. And many Sunnis see this as a major threat to the Sunni position in the Middle East and in the world of Islam in general. I think that may help to explain why during the recent Lebanon war, the support of the Sunni states for the Lebanese cause was, shall we say, minimal. On the contrary, they were hoping that the Israelis would do a job and were very disappointed when they didn't.
Okay. Sorry.
One other one. I see in this also a sign of hope. Why did Sadat decide to make peace? It wasn't that he was suddenly converted to Zionism. No. It was that he realized that Egypt was confronting a more dangerous enemy than Israel. He saw the danger that Egypt was becoming a colonial dependency of the Soviet Union. I saw that myself visiting Egypt at that time. And he decided that on the best estimate of Israel's power and the worst estimate of Israel's intentions, Israel was less dangerous to Egypt than was the Soviet Union, and that he'd better therefore make terms with Israel in order to avoid the greater danger. I think it was that led Sadat into the peace process. I think we may be seeing similar motivations at the present time in several Arab governments who feel that the Shia crescent, as some call it, or the Shia axis, could represent a much greater danger to them, to their regimes, to their societies, than anything that Israel could do, even on the worst estimate of Israel. And that, I think, there is a possibility which might be exploited.
Two questions, if I may. Number one, when people speak of I think an English term I've read was the Twelvers around the sect that looking for the arrival, the advent of the 12th Imam among Ahmadinejad and people around him. How broad is that? How broad? How wide? Kama Murchab is that group? Does it extend throughout? I think they just had elections for the Supreme Council in Iran. In other words, if Ahmadinejad was lost an election or knocked off, would it make a difference? Number two, given the fear that you just spoke about of that's starting in the broader Sunni world of the Shia ascendancy, this past Sunday's London Times spoke about putative, supposed Israeli plans to penetrate, to destroy the Iranian nuclear facilities with the use of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, only 15% of Hiroshima strength. If Israel were to do that, would the Arab world sit quietly, or would they jump on the opportunity to jump on Israel?
I think it's very clear that the major concern of Sunni Arab governments at the present time is the Shia threat, which is a very real one. Remember that apart from the Shia crescent that I spoke of before, the term was used by King Abdullah, there are significant Shiite minority populations in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf states, suppressed, one might almost say persecuted minorities, and they could become very dangerous in an apocalyptic situation. I think that the concern is real and well-grounded. On the other hand, according to the best information available, support for Ahmadinejad in his own country, in Iran, is minimal. Thanks to the wonders of modern communication, one can now talk to people in Iran. One can know what's going on in a way that would have been inconceivable in earlier days. And all the evidence is that the great majority of the Iranian people are thoroughly fed up with this regime in all its aspects, and more particularly with this present one, for which they have no sympathy at all. I've been told again and again and again by Iranian friends, including some who are still in Iran, that the news program that is the most followed, the most respected, is the news in Persian from Israel. That, I think, tells you something interesting.
Thank you, Professor Lewis. I'm still not clear to what extent this messianic fervor that comes from Iran is confined to a very small group, or whether it does in fact have influence on the rest of the Shiite world, or whether the rest of the Shiite world shares that. And if they do, is there any explanation as to why Iranians who are not Arabs managed to hold the ascendancy in that leadership, which I would have expected would be more likely to go Arab to Arab?
The support for Ahmadinejad is probably greater outside Iran than inside Iran. The evidence, as I said before, is that his position in Iran is maintained by brute force, and that the great majority of Iranians oppose it. On the other hand, he obviously has an enormous appeal for a lot of people outside Iran, particularly in places like Iraq and Syria, and potentially in places like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, where there are what I think one can reasonably describe as persecuted Shia populations. Let me add one word from an Iranian friend talking about Ahmadinejad, who said, he is crazy, but he's not stupid.
Yeah, Professor Lewis, could you elaborate a bit on your concluding statement about apocalypse being an inducement, not a deterrent? Do you have any scenario, perhaps, that you could tell us about regarding when, how, in what circumstances, what would happen?
You have no doubt noticed in the past that Muslim terrorists seem to have no compunction in killing large numbers of their own people. I mean, the bombing, for example, of the American embassies in East Africa to kill a dozen American diplomats involved killing 100 or more local people many of whom were Muslims. And that didn't bother them in the least. If they destroy Israel, they would also destroy Palestine and all the Palestinians. But again, if one talks about this, the answer is always the same. Allah will know His own. If you kill Muslims in a terrorist attack, you're actually doing them a favor by giving them a quick, free pass to the divine brothel in the skies.
Please.
Good evening, Professor Lewis. You remarked before that it is meaningless to compare the past conflict between Catholics and Protestants with the Sunni and Shiite. And every scholar of Islamic history, as young as he may be, must agree with this. However, there is a parallel, namely friendly coexistence. And friendly coexistence. So I asked myself, why don't we see that in the Islamic world?
As friendly coexistence is possible, it has happened in the past, it may happen again. But remember, Islam is now at the beginning of the 15th century.
Okay, you're saying that the key word is patience?
I mean that the great struggle has not yet been completed. I mean, Christianity exhausted itself in the 30 Years' War. It was after the 30 Years' War that they finally decided that they had enough fighting about religion, about different forms of the faith, and that some way should be found of separating church and state. The Muslims have always said in the past, with some justification, that the separation of church and state is a Christian remedy for a Christian disease, and therefore irrelevant to Muslim needs. I think they may now be beginning to realize that they have contracted this Christian disease, and therefore that it might not be a bad idea to consider the Christian remedy.
Thanks.
I think we'll take the last question.
Professor Lewis, if assured destruction is an inducement, and presuming that Ahmadinejad believes what he says and says what he believes, do you see any solution to solving the Iranian nuclear crisis except for denying Iran nuclear weapons? And finally, if Ahmadinejad is so unpopular, do you think that the time slot for fomenting regime change from the bottom up could come before Iran acquires the point of no return?
That requires more information than I have at my disposal. I have various stories from various people. I'm inclined to think that the time to an Iranian nuclear weapon is rather less than we have been led to believe. But I don't think they would do anything with just one or two. You need to have a stock of them before you can do anything dangerous. And I think that it is possible, I'm assured from very good sources, that it is possible to accomplish regime change in Iran if one sets about it the right way. And this I am assured passionately from Iranian sources, not only abroad but in Iran. I don't have much confidence in the military method, which seems to be dangerous and uncertain. I'm no expert on military matters.
The second lecture of Professor Lewis will be on January 25th. Same time, same place. The subject is Islam, the West, and the Jews. And thank you very much, Professor Lewis, and all of you.